Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Real Talk. I'm Scott with Ganel-lyn. Ganel-lyn, how you feeling today?
I'm great. I'm excited for today.
Me too. We are finishing another book, which is always like one of those really great, like get the ice cream out, celebrate with your kids.
Yeah, it helps you know you're progressing on some level, right?
Absolutely. I love it. So thank you all for supporting us, sharing with us, engaging with us on social media. We really appreciate your comments and your feedback. If you would please like and subscribe, click the bell for future notifications. Anything you can do to share what we're doing here would be wonderful to grow our community. The more we grow, the more diverse we get and the better this all gets. So thank you all for what you've done already, and we really appreciate it. So this week we're doing Mosiah 29 through Alma 4. They were steadfast and immovable.
Right.
Two great scripture words right there.
I wish that we could have that like put on t-shirts as a reminder or like tattooed. I know, that could be controversial, but I feel like that's just a statement of faith that they were steadfast and immovable, that the Condis, that the Sorensens were steadfast and immovable. And I love that in verse 20 right away, they're talking about, once again, a deliverance. And we've talked about that a lot the last few weeks, but I love this verse. It's one of those power scriptures that helps me remember not just to be God reliant, but that he is so willing to be there for me. And it's verse 20 of Mosiah 29. But behold, he did deliver them because they did humble themselves before him, and because they cried mightily unto him, he did deliver them out of bondage. And thus the Lord worked with his power in all cases among the children of men. And I love that idea that in all cases God can show up, and that often all that's required of me is, am I willing to mightily pray and cry unto him? And I just love to invite our listeners to consider the last time they cried mightily unto the Lord to deliver them. Was it when you were struggling with an addiction? Was it in behalf of one of your kids? I think some of the most cry mightily prayers I've had are in behalf of my kids. And I think that the Lord is very aware of the stewardship assignments we have, and maybe sharing that experience with your kids, like we've seen with Lehi and Alma and others, that inspires your kids to know they can cry to the Lord. And that means you kind of don't hold anything back.
I think that's I love that verse so much, because I always have thought of it, but behold, it says he did deliver them. But I often change the word did to could. He could deliver them because they cried mightily. Like the Lord is always mighty to save, but sometimes we just simply don't choose the deliverance path. We want to choose other paths for a variety of other reasons. I think it's so good. One of the things I wanted to say about Mosiah 29, I didn't want to say a lot here, if that's okay, but this is where they shift from going the reign of the kings to the reign of the judges. And so it's a really interesting, if you're political, if you really are interested in government and that's something that lights a fire in you, this is a chapter that you're very well aware of. But what I would say for any of you to do this week, I would encourage you in your Gospel Library app, if you go into the library, then go to Topics, and then go to Gospel Topics, and then scroll down and go to Religious Freedom. It is amazing in there. There's a bunch of content in there. There's 2 quotes from Joseph Smith about how he would defend the faith of a Muslim or a Presbyterian, or those quotes that were like, where are they? Well, they're in your Gospel Library app under Religious Freedom. And then there's also a video in there. I think it's the first video, and it's called What is Religious Freedom? It's about a 5-minute video that I think could explain this to if you have I don't know, maybe older primary kids to teenagers, what religious freedom is and why it's so important to fight for religious freedom. So that might be something that you do that kind of breaks out of the scripture reading block, but still gets you to have a conversation about what we can do in our own government and in our own governing systems.
And we just took care of family home evening and or come follow me lesson for you here at Real Talk. And I would just add to that the idea that these people have kind of a slave mentality, and that is easy to judge when we're in gospel doctrine or when we're studying and we're like, oh, why were the children of Israel so resistant to be out of slavery? Or why are these Book of Mormon slaves still so dependent on a king? but we're all going through a really vulnerable global experience. And so I think we all have eyes on government right now. And it's easy to want a king or someone that's going to steady that vulnerability for us. And so you can see where to go from this king slave mentality to this republic or judge system was really scary for them, and it was unknown, and they had to kind of have a big spiritual like shift in their minds and sociological change to really embrace it. And so before we judge too much about the judges and the resistance, you can see why with all the wars and all the changes and all the immigration that there was some vulnerability there. So I would just add that, and I think that invitation to watch the video is a great one. Our family's going to do that this week.
Yeah, it's so good. I just stumbled upon it when I was writing my book. I put that in my book, and it really, really struck me. So anyway, I think it's a good one. So let's, if it's all right, let's move on to the Book of Alma.
Yeah.
And you know how much I love
all the confetti's coming down.
That's right, confetti cannons. Why don't we have confetti cannons?
I don't know. Maybe can string, or whatever that string, whatever.
String?
Right. I don't even know.
Dries your clothes when it gets wet.
String, yes, yes.
All right. Well, you know how much I love a good overview, Ganel-lyn.
Love a good overview and a good side-by-side table.
So you got you've got 63 chapters. By the way, I'm really proud of this in my book. This is all in here. This is one of those chapters I'm really, really proud of. So this is all in there if you've got my book. But
you should be proud of the whole book.
I am, but you know how some just really lit a fire when you wrote it. This was one of them for me.
I hear you.
So let me give it to you. The Book of Alma is broken down into three main sections. Chapters 1 through 44 is written by Alma the Younger. And the first part is Alma trying to create church unity in Zarahemla and some of the surrounding Nephite lands. And it also includes Ammon and the sons of Mosiah and their missionary work to the Lamanites. Okay, so that's chapters 1 through 44. Chapter 45 through 62. This was written by Helaman, like we are the armies of Helaman, right? That guy. It's him. So he's one of Alma's sons, and he writes those chapters. We call these the war chapters. And then the last chapter, 63, was written by another one of his sons named Shiblon, who is one of my scripture heroes.
Mine too.
And he just writes about Nephite exploration. So that's really the three big chunks of the Book of Alma.
I love that. And one of my little overviews that I think is just a quick synopsis of what's going on here in the context to add to what you're saying is right at the beginning of the Book of Alma, we're seeing that the people are starting to be lifted up in the pride of their hearts and wearing costly apparel. There's much affliction and trial in the church because they've had some growth, right? And their hearts become hardened because there are people that are now becoming excommunicated. And these aren't like your enemies. These are people that you love. And a lot of those people withdraw themselves from the church, but then turn around in verse 25, where they start to heap upon persecution on those that are trying to stay in the church, live the commandments, and those in the church are trying to bear that with patience. And it feels like that is a description of 2020. I mean, I feel like all of us, there's not a family. I just had a conversation with a beautiful Brazilian grandma, and out of her 4 kids, 2 of them have left the church in the last few years, and her grandchildren are approaching baptism age. And we sat and cried together because it's broken her heart a little bit, and she's petition the Lord and receive comfort, but that's a hard thing. And so I would just invite us to ponder as real talkers what we're doing to handle people we love walking away from the faith, and maybe then turning around and heaping persecution upon us.
Well, and going back to the title of the lesson, they were steadfast and immovable. Maybe that's one of the key principles is how can we be lovingly and compassionately steadfast and immovable as the church continues to go through growing pains. And it will continue that way. Like, make no mistake, it's not going to change until the second coming of Christ. And so, I love that you brought up that pattern, because as you were saying that, I've never noticed that. I'm like, man, you are describing the way that a lot of us feel at this time.
Yeah. So we have some heart of this lesson. I mean, we really love everything we try to share with you. We're never trying to give you fluff. We really want to invite the Spirit. But I'm so excited, Scott, about what you taught me in pre-show prep about costly apparel and modesty. And before everyone turns off their screen.
Well, if anything, you'll just not like what I say, and that's let me know. Okay.
I think it's great.
But this is something that I think a lot of us have a lot of opinions about. And so I'm going to try and take away as much of my personal judgment and feelings, because I want to strip that away so the Spirit can be in this conversation. What you'll get is you're going to get Nehor introduced in Alma chapter 1, who's an antichrist. So someone who openly opposes Christ, or a lifestyle that doesn't need a savior. And so I think you get to verse 4 and you'll get to him talking about God created everyone. He's going to save everyone. So don't worry about it. Do whatever you want, like party it up. And really what he's doing is just undermining the power of personal agency. And so, which is an antichrist mentality. And so anyway, as we go through, you're going to compare priestcraft and the influence priestcraft can have, and priesthood and the influence that it can have through Alma and the members of the church. And so, yeah, it describes them, and it says that they, in Alma 1 verse 6, it talks about Nehor and says that that him and the people that followed him were lifted up in pride, and they wore very costly apparel. And then if you go to verse 27, it's talking about the followers of Christ, and it says, or the Christians, and it says they did not wear very costly apparel, but were neat and comely, which are two interesting adjectives for clothing. And so most of us, it would be fun in a classroom to be like, what does neat and comely mean? And then make a list on the board. Well, I looked it up. Neat in Latin, the Latin word where we get neat from actually means to shine. It means to be clear, to be fair, fine, and pure. The word comely, C-O-M-E-L-Y, in our current Merriam-Webster dictionary, it says to have a pleasing appearance, not homely or plain.
Which I think most people, yeah, we were talking about that as we were preparing, that most people would probably say, if you ask them what did they think this meant, it probably meant, well, you better be really boring in your appearance.
Yeah, and so I don't see that at all. I don't see that in the narrative here. That's not what is being described. So one of the struggles that we have, the tensions we have in the church, is that we take modesty, and when we say modesty, we mean clothing, and those two are the same thing. Clothing is modesty. Modesty is clothing. I've done this in my seminary classes just to see, and I'll get up and say, hey, for the next 15 minutes, we're going to have a really serious discussion on modesty. And then I stop and I watch the reaction, and I watch the girls look down, their eyes dart around, their shoulders come in, they almost close up like they want to hide. And then it's funny, the guys have a opposite reaction. They're like, oh, I don't have to listen. This is a message for the girls. And this isn't a great analogy, but it's the best I can come up with, and maybe it'll make some sense. To me, that's like going to Disneyland and only riding the Winnie the Pooh ride. Okay? Like, I get it's part of the park. Okay? I'm not trying to diminish Winnie the Pooh and all of his, forest creature friends, but it's not really the main reason someone spends $800 a day to get their family into Disneyland. There's so much more. And when we hyper-focus on clothing equals modesty, we miss all the beauty that modesty is. And that's really what we're doing. We're just missing so much. And I'm not so sure that clothing is generally the thing that's modest or immodest. Modesty is a divine attribute of Jesus Christ. And so if you have been openly shamed or judged unfairly because of your clothes, I'm sorry. And maybe I want to give a couple of things that might be useful. In situations like this, we can all choose to be offended, or we can choose to educate. And so I'm going to try and educate here just for a minute and give you 3 things that might help. So let's do this. Let me start with a warning, maybe something we could steer clear from. And this often comes up in seminary. People will say, well, if we're talking modesty, and then they say some form of, the young women need to dress a certain way so the young men don't have impure thoughts. And I will kindly just say, let's do better than that. I don't know anywhere else in the scriptures where we teach, I sinned, and it's your fault. I just don't know anywhere else where we do it. And it makes it really hard for the Spirit to testify of truth when what we're saying is not necessarily in line with truth. And I've thought about this as a guy, like, if that's true, then I really don't have control over my thoughts. And it's demeaning to me, and it's super shaming to women and young women especially. And so maybe steer clear of that idea.
It's taking away your agency.
Mm-hmm. I believe so. I believe it's an anti-grace fundamental teaching, because it doesn't teach that the grace of Christ can change the way I think. And I just simply don't believe that. So let me give you two ways to focus on. Okay, so one of them comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 20. And as I say these, will you please pay attention to how you feel in observation and try and stay out of a judgment mindset here. So 1 Corinthians 6:20, I think is a core verse about what modesty is. And the verse before it is one of those, your body is a temple, or the temple of the Holy Ghost. And it says in there, in 1 Corinthians 6:20, therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit. And so then you start thinking, well, how does Jesus glorify in body and spirit? How did he do it? Well, notice the reaction that people had after Jesus performed miracles for them. It often says they went away singing and praising God and glorifying God. That's modesty. That's a modest interaction that they had with Christ. Think of the woman taken in adultery. At the very end of that, it says, and the woman glorified God from that hour and believed on his name. Well, what actions and attitudes and behaviors and words did he use in order to dignify this woman to a place where she wanted to glorify God? And then I thought about this, and I'll just ask this question. How did Jesus use his body and his spirit to glorify us? And that is also getting at this divine attribute of modesty that Christ has. And so we could also talk about the gift of a physical body in this. If we of all people, man, we should embrace the gift of physical bodies and really have a creative, expansive view on the beauty of a body, because it is fundamentally connected to our eternal salvation. We cannot become like God without one. And so maybe talk about and celebrate the bodies we have, even if they don't work very well right now. Then it's a discussion about resurrection. And you can see that's a discussion that we're having right now where the Spirit can testify. So let me add one more thing here really quick. And there's a lot more to be said here. But if you do want to talk about clothing, this comes from my wife, who's a professional fashion stylist. So she clearly has a lot of investment, and she's really wrestled with this. And she's talked about, so this is Genesis 3, verse 21 is where I want to get to. But basically it's the fall narrative where Adam and Eve partake of the fruit, and now it's the, oh no, now what? And it says that they were naked. Now, please don't misunderstand that word. They didn't generate the conditions of the fall, and then now all of a sudden they're worried about their clothes or if their skin's covered. That's not what nakedness means. It means that they were, are we redeemable? Are we lost? Are we totally exposed and there is no saving us? In our day, that could be feelings like being misunderstood or unemployed for a long period of time, feeling betrayed or abused or addicted or going viral for a negative reason. Those are all nakedness kind of feelings. So what does the Lord do? He makes a coat of skin to cover them. Now, that coat of skin, all it's meant to tell them, it's an object lesson. It's not meant to say, now your clothes need to be here, here, and here. What it's meant to say is, it's meant to say, because of Jesus Christ, he will wrap you up and save you. You're no longer naked. You can be saved. You are redeemable. And me, the way I put it is, we are worth saving. And so those of you who are endowed members of the church, every time you put on your garment, you may want to think about that object lesson. And rather than think, this is where my clothing limitations are, think about it bigger. No, what it's saying is, Jesus can save you. He wants to save you. He will save you. He wants to wrap you around. He wants to encircle you in the arms of his love. And now go back and look at verse 27 in Alma chapter 1. And notice what it's saying before. It says, and they did impart of their substance, every man according to that which he had, to the poor and the needy and the sick and the afflicted. And they did not wear costly apparel, yet they were neat and comely. We focus on the clothes part. We forget the actual modesty lesson, which is the beginning of the verse, not the end of the verse. And I believe deeply that the Spirit in these kind of mindsets can testify and help us have a more expansive view of what modesty is. And we could teach a 60-minute lesson on modesty and never mention the word clothing at all.
Yeah, because it's about relationships and intention, right? And if you're building your home or getting dressed to glorify God, then a culture could decide. I mean, if we look too far back, to any cultural marking about what modesty was. At one point, it was showing your ankles, right? And so, or wrists, or whatever that is. And so if we get too hyper focused on that, then we're missing the relationship experience of glorifying God in all that we do. And so whether that's changing diapers like we've talked about, or it's getting dressed every day in a comely manner, which is handsome and light feeling, right? And I know your wife is so beautiful at that, at consulting with people so that their dress enlightens the world and brings light to the world. And I think you're right. That's definitely the approach I've tried to have with my teenage daughter from a young age, to say, when you're making choices, how does it make you feel? Does it make you feel light? Does it make you feel powerful? Does it make you feel joyful? Then that's the direction you can head into. And so that internal compass happens versus this pharisaical or Sadducee approach to parenting sometimes that we take to modesty. So thank you, Scott, for sharing those thoughts.
Thanks for giving me some time, Ganel-lyn.
Yeah, no, I love it. And I think it's an important topic, and I think it can be triggering, and I think we all have stories around it. And I think it's important at Real Talk that we bring up those subjects. And it brings us right into Alma 3. If you've missed, Scott and I were guests on Sean Rapier's podcast, and what is it called?
Latter-day Lives.
Latter-day Lives, thank you. There's two podcasts that have a similar name, so I didn't want to say the wrong name. And I had heard this story before, and then Sean shared it, and it has to do with Brother Brad Wilcox, who is now a new member of the Young Men's Presidency. So Alma 3 is talking about the Amlicites marking themselves and it fulfilling a prophecy that they were cursing themselves. And I think oftentimes we do that. We create a curse or a mark on ourselves where we, like the way I visualized it when I would read Alma 3 is the chip on the shoulder, right? And it's the thing that we're leading out with. Sean Rapier talks about going to a youth fireside years and years and years ago that Brad Wilcox was presenting at. And he was really into a girl who was active in the church, and Sean was not. And he had a huge mohawk, big combat boots, big leather coat, like if you can visualize it. He had marked himself because he wanted the world to know, stay away. Like, I'm angry at everything that doesn't, fit and jive with this mojo of mine. And classic Brad Wilcox, he's become a dear friend of mine, and this is pure heart Brad. Brad sees this mohawked kid in the back where these big combat boots are. Instead of seeing it as a curse and a mark, Brad invited Sean to the front. He said, could you come on up here? And he celebrated those combat boots and actually asked to wear them. Like, he was so positive about these combat boots. It completely softened Sean's heart. And anyone who knows Sean Rapier, he's got a big heart. And if you know Brad Wilcox, he's got a big heart. And for some reason, I just felt like this chapter really, for me, invited me to think of that story and how I interact with people. And sometimes we mark ourselves with our own curses because we're hurt or we're trying to protect ourselves. What would change if we change how we responded to what we see as a curse, whether it's a mohawk, combat boots, ear piercings, tattoos? I'm just throwing out some of the things, not all the things, right? That we sometimes use to mark ourselves, or we respond to other people and we label it as a curse. And I love that Brad Wilcox just didn't. And I love that here in this chapter of Alma 3, we get this invitation to consider how we may be doing that or responding to each other that way.
Yeah, and I like that you can repurpose it, you can redefine it, you can change it by your intentions and attitude, and that's all that Brad did. And so let's wrap up here. Let's go to Mosiah 4:19. Alma the younger is noticing some fracturing in the church, and so he gives up the chief judgment seat to Nephi, and then goes out fully on the ministry path. And one of the things he says in there is he talks about that there was no way to reclaim these people save it were in bearing down pure testimony. And I love that idea of a pure testimony. I think of that as an authentic, a real testimony, not a fully developed testimony. That what you have, and Elder Hollins talked about this, and President Uchtdorf, that like what you have, stay faithful to that and bear that kind of a testimony. You may not know everything is quote unquote true, but you may believe some things are good and real and meaningful. And I think that's what Alma was really doing. Was I would assume Alma had a very authentic testimony from his background, and what a beautiful way to express a pure testimony that really reaches into the hearts of people.
And I think you and I both have examples. I've interacted with missionaries that weren't polished, that didn't have all the answers, but expressed very humble, authentic testimony, and the Spirit rushes in. And when we make it complicated, sometimes the Spirit steps back. And so I love the idea of an authentic, pure testimony really turning a whole civilization.
All right, so to finish up, let's go to Alma 4:19. We get this interesting dynamic where Alma sees fractures in the church, so he gives up his leadership in the government, and he goes into full minister mode. And so he says something really beautiful in Alma 4:19, and he says that the people were struggling and seeing no way that he might reclaim them, save it were in bearing down a pure testimony against them. Ganel-lyn, do you have any thoughts on that beautiful, pure testimony of Alma the Younger?
Well, I'm thinking of times where there was a simple testimony born in sacrament meeting by a child, or a missionary that struggles with social anxiety, and the Spirit floods in, because the simpler we keep it, the more the Spirit can be a part of it. And so sometimes we make things too complicated. And so that invitation that you can change a whole community, society, or a family by simply bearing a simple testimony that's pure, we need to not underestimate the power of that. And so that's really our invitation this week. Where can you bear pure testimony this week? Maybe it's in your Come Follow Me lesson, or your family home evening lesson. Maybe if you're studying with Scott and I on Real Talk and you're single, maybe you share on social media, or you call a friend or a family member and just share an experience where you felt the Spirit and you felt that power of pure testimony. So we invite you this week to share simple, pure testimony, because it has a huge impact. And we're so grateful you joined us as we have begun the book of Alma. We invite you to like and subscribe on our platforms so that we can stay connected with you. And we'll see you again next week on Real Talk, Come Follow Me.